Thank you, everyone. I didn't make the poll this morning because the last time I was in Shanghai was in 1997, and that city today for me is unrecognisable. It is a city of the population of Australia with a history of thousands of years, but at the same time it is now one of the big modern international cities. And there's some fantastic and fabulous commercial architecture. And yet, in walking over here today, it struck me that there are also, from Xintiandi, there's also some very small, intimate streets. And what is most noticeable to me today was the parks. And as Albert Chan said this morning, it is a very safe city. And for me, personally, that is a feeling as well as a fact. So in that context, I wanted to welcome you today to our panel, The Future of Urban Housing, creating great places where people want to live. You all have the app, and I really encourage you to provide some questions for us today. We're very keen to get into that discussion. I had the privilege of speaking to the panellists before the conference, and we had a very lively discussion across 3 continents, and so I'm looking forward to hearing their presentations today. So I wanted to introduce firstly Tony Shorris and then Wong Summ. Tony is a senior advisor at McKinsey, and he's also a visiting professor at Princeton. Tony is proudest of his recent work as the first deputy mayor of New York City, which is otherwise known as the chief operating officer, where he led over 375,000 staff, managed an almost $90 billion budget, and he oversaw 60 separate agencies. And so he probably didn't sleep for about 4 years, I would suggest. And during this time in office, New York added more jobs than any time since World War II, had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, as well as the lowest crime rate ever measured, and took major steps towards his administration's goal of moving 800,000 people out of poverty and near poverty. To advance New York's growth, Tony led the effort to offer over 1 million residents municipal ID cards, provide 75,000 children with full-day pre-kindergarten, and supported the creation and preservation of 300,000 units of affordable housing. Tony is a passionate supporter of ULI as a member of ULI New York and has spoken at a number of ULI conferences, including most recently in Hong Kong last summer. Wong Summ is co-founding director of WOHA, in a Singapore-based architectural practice he founded with Richard Hassel in 1994. And the practice has advocated since its beginning socially and environmentally sustainable design and placed its emphasis on finding solutions to the problems cities of the 21st century are facing. And in their book, Garden City, Megacity, WOHA lay out the design strategies they have developed in their 25 years of research and innovation work. The practice shares their design thinking in various forums such as universities and conferences, and ULA has been one of the organisations that has recognised the importance of their work by awarding them the 2017-2018 ULI Global Awards for Excellence for the Oasia Hotel Downtown. Most recently, their Kampong Admiralty Project and integrated public housing development for senior citizens in Singapore was chosen as the World Building of the Year at the 2018 Architectural Festival. So the speakers are on strict instructions on the timing, and so I'll hand it over to you, Tony.
Oh, thank you, Jane. Thank you. Welcome. Ni hao, wan, wata minzu, Tony Shorris, Wailaitsu, New York City. And I'm very happy to be here with you in this beautiful city of Shanghai. That city is obviously very different from the one I come from, but not as different in some respects as it would seem. This is my city, the city that I managed the government for 4 years, as Jane described, which faced many of the challenges that all great world cities face. The most important of which is creating places where people want to live. And that was one of the primary challenges I faced when I took over the management of the government in 2014. To think about the opportunity that our city faced, to think about the challenges that were in front of us, to think and develop strategies through a long-term plan for New York, and to develop tools that long-term would get us the people, the human capital that we needed to make New York City a great city. People are coming to our cities. We know this. I grew up in a time when 2/3 of the world lived in rural communities. By the time my son's that age, 2/3 of the people will live in the cities. And they're coming to cities, and the firms are coming with them. And the firms come to our cities because of economic growth and innovation and because they're safe, but they really come because of talent and the labor pool. And to get those people to come to our cities, we need infrastructure and housing, and those are the challenges we need to talk about. And those were the focus of many of the plans we developed for New York. Growth is increasingly growing in the great world metropolitan areas. The GDP of New York and Tokyo are the largest, but the growth is very high in cities like Shanghai, Beijing. New York still has one of the highest rates of GDP growth as a share of the world economy of any major metropolitan area. And with that growth comes skilled workers. For the last decade, more and more people who are college educated are coming to New York, and people who lack education and lack the ability to generate the incomes they need to afford the housing have been leaving New York. And skilled workers come to New York not just from the United States, but from around the world. The vast preponderance of H-1B visas, people primarily from India and China, but from the rest of the world, come to New York, of all American cities, 30-some%. And the people who come to New York create the wealth of New York. $250,000 a year of income makes you a high-earning person in New York and in America, and as you can see, New York dwarfs every other American city in the number of people who earn high incomes. And of ultra-high net worth individuals, those who have assets of more than $30 million, New York is one of the great world cities, growing more quickly than most, but these people are pouring into the world cities. And when those people come, they drive up prices. And the price of housing becomes one of the great challenges for world cities, like New York, like Shanghai, like many of the cities we all come from. Those higher prices mean that New Yorkers are paying close to half their income to afford their housing. And that's crowding out many of the other things they want to do. And that's why when we had to develop a strategic plan for New York, we focused, of course, on sustainability and resiliency, topics we've all been talking about in the last 2 days, but primarily on growth and on bringing equity and opportunity to people who are otherwise left behind. The biggest priority of our investment plan, of course, was around our infrastructure. $266 billion of investment over 10 years in the New York area, $250 billion. The largest single component, of course, around transportation, so that people can access the jobs and so employers can access the labor markets, the core challenge that we've been talking about for so many world cities. But the key pain point for our city is housing. And that's why intervening in the housing market was a key focus of our strategy, both preserving housing that was reasonably affordable to people and building new, and using every tool available, tools all of us use in our work, whether it's rezoning and land use controls or use of public lands or subsidization and financing or targeting our pension funds, all the tools we would use to try and increase the housing supply in New York. But it's not just about supply. We know that people are feeling pressure as a result of these high costs and the high demands of their work. They are working more hours and they need more flexible schedules, half of Americans working from home. The demands of their work are reducing the time they have for their private life. They're putting pressure on them to invest in their own health and wellness, something we talked about yesterday. And those digital lifestyles are increasing their sense of isolation and alienation. And so people are splurging more on experiences rather than material things to get a sense of community. And that unaffordability is what's putting the pressure on to make trade-offs throughout their life. The market's beginning to respond to help us deal with some of those gaps. We've been talking about technology a lot over the last couple of days, technology and managing buildings, but these are technologies that help us manage our lives, that help us find ways to use our space more efficiently, our apartments more efficiently, to help us protect our time so we can balance work and home, to support our commitment to our health and our wellness, even to give us a sense of community and a sense of shared experience, something that's so important in the pressured lives we live in. So when we put that together, we think about how we create places, we, at least those of us who manage cities, where people want to live. We know 21st century economics are going to drive people to cities. And we know firms will want to locate where the people are who add the value that those firms seek to create. So where do people want to live? They're going to want to live where there's opportunity that they can access, especially with the transportation to good jobs. They want to live where there's housing they can afford, and that's why we have to address the supply. They want to live where they can live safe and healthy lives, and that's why the quality of life investments. They need to feel a sense of community, whether through the technology that I was just showing or investments in the social capital of our communities and our school systems and parks and cultural amenities. And finally, they will live in places where they can feel a balance between their work and their home life. And that's what some of that technology is going to help us do. It is our job in the city government of New York to try and invest in physical infrastructure, but also in human infrastructure and in the technology that will help us maximize the quality of our lives. Now, it's not just about physical assets, we all understand. Good design matters. And good design is made by people who are creative and thoughtful, like the colleague who I'm happy to turn our podium over to. This is a project from WOHA, which you'll hear more about, which is not my project, but I just wanted to show it as an example of the recognition that we have that while we will provide the infrastructure to make these cities competitive and desirable, great design is going to make them places people want to be. So with that, I say, xie xie.
4 to 5 years ago, we put out this book, Garden City, Mega City, Rethinking Cities of the Age of Global Warming. It is a call to arms book for students and decision makers. Concerned with what's happening around the globe, we wanted to share and suggest alternative and new strategies and ideas for the mega cities, a paradigm shift from a city two-dimensionally to a more compact, three-dimensional system thinking city. In one of the chapters in the book, Rating Cities, we propose a social and ecological rating system instead of the commonly used economic and spatial efficiency indexes. These ratios are Green Plot Ratio and Ecosystem Contribution Index are about reversing the imbalance of man-made and nature, creating integrated landscaping and bring back biodiversity into our cities. Community Plot Ratio and civic indexes, a civic generosity index, are about breaking down walls and gates in developments and encouraging and facilitating public life of a city. Self-sufficiency index is the development capacity to generate its own clean energy, food, and water. We will now view short videos of 3 of our projects in Singapore, which shows how pushing these ratings and systems make building and cities more livable and also resilient. Park Royal and Pickering is a hotel and office building in Singapore, completed in 2007. We wanted to push the green replacement agenda by almost 2.5 times the site area, the same size as the urban park it faces, and make a sexy statement the hotel can use for marketing and public relations. Skyville at Dawson is a social housing project comprising 6 47-story towers interconnected by communal sky parks at every 11th story, with a rooftop sky park we call Penthouse for the People, consisting of 960 homes arranged into 12 sky villages, each village clustered around common social and green spaces.
No doubt this residential complex is quite big scale. It's like concrete jungle, but yet at the same time, it is quite small scale in the sense that the units are actually housed within certain villages. They're actually connected by all these intermediate sky gardens. It makes us want to not just stay within our homes, okay, but really to spend some time outside to just interact and bond with one another.
I think with all this being presented together, it increases the chance for interaction and also engaging the neighbor and the people around you. That's something that's lacking around in many parts of Singapore where you're just purely living in an urban jungle.
The idea of this building is trying to make it like a kampong style where you really try to meet up each other. When you're getting quite late in the night, it's actually very quiet. And the wind is good.
So we can have our dinners while enjoying the view over there. That makes it a perfect place for us to communicate and then to socialize among other neighbors.
And lastly, Kampong Admiralty is a social mixed-use development. This is a prototype of an integrated urban village that's located next to a train station, combines public housing for our senior citizens with public space, social and medical amenities, retail and F&B, a sky park, and an urban farm.
Thank you both. Just in looking at those two presentations and just thinking about for the practitioners in the room, when you are thinking about creating places where to live, great places where people want to live, where do you start, both either in a policy sense or in a design sense? Where do you start to think about, what you form up, how you want that to change, what you want that to look at, what you want that to look like?
Well, in our case, I was thinking about this from the public sector perspective, so that our job was to provide the most basic things first. So safety was premier, and part of the reason New York has been successful in recent years has been it's become a much safer city.
Which polled badly.
What's that?
It polled badly.
It did, yes, it's true, sorry, but we thought safety mattered. But beyond safety, I think people are then looking for economic opportunity. They're looking for access to jobs where they can earn a living and live a lifestyle that they believe they should be accustomed to. I think they're yearning for cultural connection to each other, to a sense of community. It's why we're seeing a lot more mixed-use development, so that people can feel they're connected both between their jobs and their homes, and the integration of the two. Investment in those kinds of cultural things makes sense. And New York is a lot about values, and one of our values is the issue of equality of opportunity. And we need to make sure that we're providing a city where people of various kinds of incomes can live. So despite that inflow of highly educated workers, we also need to protect those who don't have that education now. Some of them are seniors, but some of them are younger people who are still left behind by a very strong economic engine. So we began by looking at making sure growth was strong, because growth's the platform that pays for everything, and that equity was in everything we did. Equity of opportunity in every service that we provided, in every piece of infrastructure that we built, in every rule or regulation that we passed. And then resiliency and sustainability, because we have both responsibility for the world we're creating, and we have to react to the world others have created. So those are the sort of premises that we began with. And if we provided that platform, then a strong private market can then provide many of the additional economic opportunities.
So I'm looking through the questions on the on the survey, and a lot of the questions are about affordability. So how do you deal? How do you look at that? Because, and I saw it was a seniors housing project, affordable housing project. But how do you, where do you get to the? How do you look at the issues of affordability in that sense?
Well, affordability is a tremendous crisis for many, many large cities.
Well, it's all over the world, right? It's everywhere.
All over the world. And those forces that I was talking about are not unique to New York. They're the same forces in London, and they're the same forces in many cities, and they're coming to be the same forces here in China as well. Look, the best thing the government can do in those cases is to increase the supply of housing. And that means both creating new land and opportunities for accessing new land, but also creating the ability to build denser housing so we can afford more units on the same site. Some of it's about also increasing the supply, but also increasing people's incomes. In America, recently, a very strong effort has been to raise the minimum wage so that the poorest people can still earn a living sufficient to afford a housing stock that they can live in. So we need to do both. We need to raise incomes so housing is affordable. We need to increase supply to bring the price down. If we do that together through that 300,000 unit program I mentioned, then maybe we can start to have some impact on affordability.
So when I started my career in Australia, the densification was about dual occupancy. So you had a single family house, and if you put a house at the back on the back section of that land, that was densification in Australia. And kind of 25 plus years later, we now have a lot of densification, and it's getting a really bad rap because of a lot of bad design decisions. So when you're thinking about that design, what are you thinking about in terms of the end user and what they, and what do you hold strong to? And when your client says, we can't afford that, what do you say?
I think it's a balance, really, with design, creativity, and satisfying the client brief. And I think I'm for intensification, higher density, but when you push density up, you have to equally push amenities. So say you are increasing the plot ratio by 2 to 3 times, but at the same time, within that development, you have to insist that you push the amenities, whether it is the communal spaces or whether it is the social spaces and the green spaces within it, it should equally increase at the same rate. And I think the situation is, if it's left to the devices of economics and private developers, the aim is to make a maximized profit. But I think that's where legislation is important, and I think to a certain extent New York is successful in ensuring certain amount of affordability is built into any project. And I think that is a good formula. I mean, in Singapore, it's slightly different, where Singapore public housing accounts for about 80% of the housing stock in Singapore, and that the government can actually control the housing affordability in Singapore. But at the same time, any mature city, as it, the demands are there and it's a thriving city, construction costs, land costs always goes up. And to effectively manage the affordability is a tough balance.
But I think people experience, urban environments, even though they live in their apartment, the way they really experience it is at the ground plane. So all the money is made in the tower, but all of the experience is on the street and around, and even with the amenities inside, and we've seen a variety of those, examples of that, in the last few days when we've been on the study tour. And I'm just wondering, what do you do to encourage that better ground plane? And, what have you done personally to kind of change someone's mind about that ground plane and about those amenities to make that a better, urban outcome?
I think the ground plane is very important. I think New York has one of the more vibrant ground plane and streets. And in some areas in Singapore, it's not bad. But I think the key is having a very mixed use development. The higher the density, the higher the mixed use. But I'm proposing that we don't just keep the standard formula of having commercial in a mixed use development, but there's one that you can see in Kampong Admiralty. It's actually a social mixed use where you do mix medical facilities with residential. And I dare say that it is possible to make sense out of creating higher densities with residential development, putting in schools as well, putting in medical centers, community centers, mix it up a little bit more. And I think the whole idea of making people travel less is important. It makes people happier, it makes the carbon footprint lower. So the idea of actually mixing things up in a larger development, for me, makes a lot of sense.
And I think we're seeing some of the more progressive developers in New York look to exactly the point Summ made. Some of the larger developments are mixed use for just that reason, but also because I think in the activation of the streets, the notion of the 24-hour city is a very important element. Wall Street in New York, for example, was traditionally an entirely commercial place, and at 6 or 7 o'clock it emptied out. After 9/11, for a variety of reasons, there was an effort to put a residential community into Wall Street, and now 75,000 people live in Wall Street. And that's not just been good for the real estate, because some of it was better used as residential than commercial. It activated the community and turned it into a 24-hour community. The newest large development in New York, which is on the far west side, the related development, is literally a mix of building by building, commercial, residential, hotel, and hospitality in some cases, and retail, also designed to create a 24-hour experience. There are even buildings that within a single building, this is true at 75 Rockefeller Plaza now, that's going to have office space, it's going to have hotel space, it's going to have residential space with a retail block underneath, all designed not to be separate, but to actually be interrelated. Right. So that those tenants will use that retail space, those tenants will use the hotel services, and the corporations. So that whole notion is, I think, reflective of the fact that traditional boundaries are coming down, and our real estate has to follow that direction.
Right. But another view is that the larger we get, the more interconnected we get, the more we regress back to our communities and who we are and who we want to be with. And so I'm just wondering, and we talked about this, on the phone the other day when we were talking about this, about people want to move to a community where, they don't want to have poor people. And we're not as kind as what I think, we could be. And I know that's probably an anathema to talk about. But how do we get that integration of a variety of people into a community? How do you actively do that? How do you see that? You have a client that, for your social housing for elderly that you worked with, but how do you actually get that into those communities and get that variety of people?
Look, there's no question there's a cost to doing that.
Yeah.
And that cost is going to be borne either by the developer or by the public sector. But if your values say that in a socioeconomically integrated community is what you believe in, then that's a cost that was worth paying. So, for example, mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is something used in a number of American cities, starting in San Francisco, came to New York, says if you want to build luxury housing of a certain size, you need to have a certain share of that for people of different incomes. And those housing units have to be integrated with, not separate from, the higher income units. That's an investment in the public sector because, frankly, it reduces the value of the project. And someone's going to pay that difference. Oftentimes, the public sector does through tax abatements and other adjustments. But we believe that's part of the value of New York. We didn't want New York to become a gated community for the wealthy. And the way to do that is to invest in that kind of economic diversity.
And your experience?
From my experience, I think you can effectively do it with legislation. And I think you have to also do it equally in the same way through design to make it work. And I think it's no point making legislation and design doesn't follow through with it, and that it's shown to be not a good solution. And I think that's where design has to be equally creative to address such problems. For me, the mix of users is vital for any ecosystem. And in this case, if you talk about elderly, the elderly do not want to be shunned away and put aside. They really want to be integrated. And the pairing up of young and old is also equally an important bond as well. So and I think the value system is what you said, Tony, is absolutely right. And I think all developers, even the government, need to perceive the value system as a very important thing and package it in such a way that it's the responsibility of builders, developers, architects to actually handle all this in one go.
That's right.
Sorry. So I've got a couple of the questions here on the page, and there's one a few moments down, and for you, Tony. If you can share the Brooklyn, please, Mr. Shorris, please share the Brooklyn transformation. How did it become more inclusive to the young, to the tech startups, while balancing property values?
So Brooklyn has been one of our greatest opportunities and one of our greatest challenges. The Brooklyn transformation in part began for an obvious reason, which was Manhattan became so expensive that younger people moved into Brooklyn, and a gentrification process followed from it. And in many respects, it has become a source of some stress, because when I talk about affordability being an issue in New York, Brooklyn is the center of that. That's where housing prices have skyrocketed, in many cases more than in Manhattan. As comparing incomes to housing costs, Brooklyn is one of the most expensive places in America right now. San Francisco housing costs more, but incomes are higher. So the burden there has been tremendous. Economically for the city, it's beneficial. Of course, there are higher property values, our taxes went up, the community's gentrified, so crime rates went down. It had many positive benefits. But right now we're fighting block by block to preserve the kind of cultural, economic diversity that is so much at the heart of New York. So every major development in Brooklyn now is pressured on exactly this question as to how are you going to preserve the values that made Brooklyn what it was? How do we make sure it doesn't turn into just another Manhattan branch? So I think it's been a great thing for New York in many ways, and a lot of it was the replacement of unused industrial space, which was fine with new housing units. But where it's begun to intrude on the culture that has been in part of Brooklyn for many years, that we're fighting to protect every day.
So I just wonder on that then, if you're thinking about the, some of the design things that you have to, choose and trade off, what are the things that you hold, I always ask an architect, what are the 3 things that you want and you'll fight for and you'll resign over, and everything else is kind of collateral damage, if you like. So what are the things that you fight for in making, that block by block, urban design and, urban housing units work? And I know you talked about the amenities before, but just what are those things that you think about when you're looking at those developments from a design perspective?
For me, the ground plane is important, not to have walls and not to have gates, to be contributing towards the city is an important thing. The other thing that I think equally important for me is thinking about not of people, but other fauna and other things, living creatures, which we in cities have kind of pushed them away into to almost near to nature, to wilderness. And I think it's something that I think we kind of need to balance, reverse the imbalance, and to kind of live with nature again, and to try and see how the connection can be made again. And I think this will be the 2 most important things we kind of need to do. But maybe one last one is how within the development itself is to actually create social and community spaces. And that is one thing I think will build stronger community bonds and make the community more cohesive.
So being at the centre of a design as opposed to the peripheral kind of leftover space, so to speak. Do you ever think about, millennials take up a lot of discussion, and so when you're thinking about, what you're doing right now, are you thinking about, I'm not a millennial, obviously. How are you thinking about the design for millennials and for urban spaces, and are they different? Do they have different requirements to our generation and generations, before us?
Well, look, we're dealing now with the aging of the millennials, and the growth. The fastest growing population in America right now is people over 85.
Yeah.
And so we need to find, which is why I was so impressed with the Admiralty project, we need to find ways to create a city where people in that age group, and there will be more and more of them, as I'm going to find out soon, we need to build cities that are hospitable for them and that don't make them feel like they're peripheral to the way the city is designed. That means integrating them into communities and not segregating them. It means providing activities for them that are going to be commensurate with their interests. And people in their 80s are no longer, and certainly in their 70s, are no longer retiring.
That's right.
They're working. They're working differently, and they're working part-time, and they're working at different kinds of activities. But that means transport systems are going to have to be sensitive to people who are elderly. Their movement through the streets, and cultural amenities are going to have to continue to be provided. So I think the challenge is less the millennials in their early years.
Right.
It's going to be the millennials as they age out. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, for many world cities, many of which have older populations than New York. But I know it's true in New York. We are now thinking all the time about how to build a city that will be hospitable to people who are older.
And, there's a lot of demographics also that if you are hospitable to someone at 85, you're also hospitable to parents with prams, for example.
Right.
People with disability,
Right.
There's a whole generation of people there, and from your point of view?
I think the key is we need to be inclusive. And I think any society has young children to very old people. I think the millennium topic, I think it's one that is maybe hyped up by expensive cost of living and affordability. But, and I think that comes about the sharing economy, and I think that actually can work for a while until the millennials have babies and kids. Then they are grounded and the issues are the same.
Excellent. Well, I think that we're almost out of time, so and we've covered most of the questions, most of which were about cost of living and value, so I think we've done that. So I'd like to thank you both for sharing the panel today.